With the extensive absorption into canon law collections, the fortuna of texts from Piacenza is a very impressive phenomena. So says historian Robert Somerville. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history, warts and all, unabashedly and unashamed. This season is called All Roads Lead to Clermont, and it attempts to bring us up to date on the West, leading right up to the call for Holy War. We have followed the reigns of King Henry II of England and his two brothers Robert Curthose and Henry Beauclerc up north, and taken a quick snapshot of Iberia, crumbling under the weight of the Almoravid conquest. In addition to those, we've already also established the two major thoroughfares that Crusaders will be using in the coming confrontation, the Venetian-controlled Adriatic and the Kingdom of Hungary. Also, Matilda of Canossa, she does it again. And with this episode, we enter the year 1095 at long last. Many believe it was during this year that everything, and I mean everything, changed in the West. With Matilda's patronage and protection, Pope Urban II will begin his year by holding the most important meeting in quite some time. The world will descend upon one mid-sized Tuscan city called Piacenza. And what comes out of this week-long event will not only set the stage for what's to come, such as the First Crusade for starters, but also set serious legal and doctrinal precedent for centuries. Before we begin, if you believe in what's happening on this show, bringing our shared history to life, warts and all, free to the public with absolutely no more paywalls, ever, please consider donating to my caffeine-mediated research and writing through the website and app Buy Me a Coffee. With opportunities for one-time donations and even a monthly donation plan, you can voluntarily contribute to the continuation of this show. And while you're at it, feel free to listen on YouTube too, which has our full back catalog as well as new episodes updated as they're published. These links are all in the show notes. Now let's get to it. This is episode 164 entitled The Council of Piacenza, Part 1. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Pope Urban II had inherited a split papacy. There was a completely different guy in St. Peter's Basilica when a select group of rebellious cardinals elected him as the new pope. He didn't even step foot in Rome itself for the first 6 years of his papacy because it just wasn't safe for him. There were too many supporters of the German-backed anti-pope Clement III. But in 1094, Urban did walk into Rome. And by this time, Rome accepted him because the illusion of Clement's papacy was becoming apparent. And with Emperor Henry IV's devastating defeat to Matilda of Canossa up north a couple years earlier, well, with Henry hemmed in and essentially imprisoned inside the city of Verona, with once pro-Henry bishoprics in Milan, Lodi, and Piacenza, among many others, now distancing themselves from him and making their own alliance called La Liga, and with La Liga choosing to side with Matilda and Urban on a number of issues, well, the tides of the church were ebbing away from German influence. Translation: Henry was screwed by the year 1095. The Gregorian reforms, headed by Pope Urban II and Matilda, were once again trending on medieval X feeds everywhere. And with this wave of support and hype, Urban sought to capitalize on it. Giving Matilda the incredible honor of hosting his next meeting, all parties chose, as we know from the last episode, the centrally located Tuscan city along the mighty Po River, called Piacenza. But this was no mere meeting. This was meant to be an absolute banger, a statement that Urban was here to stay. And it was within shouting distance of Emperor Henry IV in fair Verona, which no doubt added a very purposeful insult to injury. The invitations were sent, and it looked like it would be a much bigger affair than initially planned. Now let's take a look at what the initial agenda of the Council of Piacenza, as it came to be known, would look like. It really breaks down into 3 parts. Number 1, Urban sought to gather as much of his European clergy as possible in a synod that would reaffirm Gregorian principles and directives in as crystal clear language as possible. He intended this synod to answer all possible questions one may have when they left Piacenza. Topics like simony, clerical celibacy, corruption, and investiture were to be addressed as thoroughly and as candidly as possible. Number 2, he also sought to make this a dead serious statement about the church's autonomy and even, dare I say, supremacy in church doctrine and organization and policy for all secular rulers. Now, before we address the 3rd part of the Piacenza agenda, it's worth pointing out something very important about this event. This has been known for like 1,000 years as the Council of Piacenza. But the Pope called it to establish his ecclesiastical policy and supremacy, his supremacy specifically, as the Bishop of Rome, which, that sounds an awful lot like a synod, doesn't it? Popes really don't call councils, they call synods. Synods are for establishing a unified vision for the church, which is the primary purpose of the existence of the church, right? To carry on a unified vision for practicing and teaching the lessons of Jesus Christ. But why is this called a council? Councils are typically called by secular rulers, and here we have a pope leading a council. Well, as you can imagine, it's tricky. One could make a strong argument that what happened at Piacenza was nothing but a synod, but they could also argue that what happened at Piacenza was nothing but a council. But I personally think that what happened there was a highly unique affair in which the Pope dipped his toes into secular affairs, kind of drawing right along the line there. Pope Urban II planned not to simply show support for or to suggest Gregorian reforms. Urban planned to announce to more than his clergy that his papacy encompassed more than the goings-on of some priests. His papacy, from his perspective anyway, would be about saving Christian civilization. I believe it's called a council and not a synod, even though it was a bit of both. Well, I believe that because the lasting effects of Piacenza hit the secular world far, far harder than it hit the church. Just keep that in mind going forward. Now, that 3rd part of the agenda, we've addressed Urban's reaffirmation of Gregorian reforms and his reaffirmation of the church's autonomy from the purview of noblemen and royalty across Christendom, right? But Urban had one more issue he was holding close to his chest. That 3rd piece of Piacenza's agenda involved Urban's communications he'd had with Constantinople, with Emperor Alexius I Komnenos himself even, as well as the Patriarch of Constantinople, which at the time was a man named Nicholas III Grammaticus, who actually saw eye to eye with Urban on a number of contentious issues. It was time the church began to reunite after its collapse in diplomatic relations in 1054, which is pretty topical because just in the news this past week, our current Pope, Pope Leo XIV, has also reached out to the patriarchs in the Eastern Greek Orthodoxy to try to mend those fences as well. But let's not kid ourselves here. Urban was certainly not going to concede any ground in the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome. So let's keep an eye on how that plays out too, especially in our own times with Pope Leo XIV. Is he willing to concede some of that ground? I suppose time shall only tell. So, let's switch gears. Who was in attendance at Urban's grand event at Piacenza? When the RSVP started rolling in, most were shocked. It turns out that around 200 bishops from as far away as Leon and Castile, England, Norway, and Poland, and all points in between, including Germany, which equated to around 4,000 accompanying clergy to help with all manner of jobs to assist their bishops on the difficult journey to the Po Valley. This would amount to an enormous synod, if a synod was all it really was. But again, Piacenza was something more. And get this, another 30,000 folks showed up, which included everyone from noble families to royal envoys to all the servants who worked for these people. Now, as you're well aware of by now, actual records of attendees are pretty foggy, but notables included, obviously, Pope Urban II, of course, along with his entire papal curia. Urban's two senior prelates of the curia were the following: Cardinal Bishop Bruno of Segni, a leading theologian, papal librarian, and a consistent and respected reformist voice who accompanied Urban throughout most of his papacy whenever he traveled outside of Rome. And also Cardinal Bishop Walter of Urbano, appointed in 1091 by Urban himself. Well, Bishop Walter, served as papal legate to England just 2 months after this Council of Piacenza and would carry Urban's reformist message to those unable to attend Piacenza. So Urban's court always traveled with his papal chancellor, likely a monk at the time named Johannes Gatellis, who was primarily responsible for drafting official documents. In addition to the papal chancellor, Urban always traveled with a vast cadre of subdeacons, notaries, and chaplains, whose jobs were to record, witness, and broadcast Urban's message across Christendom through chroniclers, letters, or even missions. To be fair, this was the backbone of any papal curia for most of church history. Now, from here, we can reasonably deduce that several of Urban's trusted cardinals were present, which most likely included the following: Cardinal Renarius of Reggio Calabria, who was seen at a number of other events and synods, so it's hard to accept that he would sit this one out. This also ensured that Great Count Roger of Sicily's Duchy of Calabria, I know it wasn't his, but he was the count of it, it also ensured that Calabria was represented as well. Cardinal Richard of St. Victor of Marseille was a frequent attendee of Urban's as well, so it's likely Marseille had representation. Cardinal Tuezo of Saints Johannes and Pauli, Cardinal Albertus of Santa Sabina, and Cardinals Dagobert, the Archbishop of Pisa, and Amatus, Archbishop of Bordeaux, were also most likely in attendance, as they were staunch Gregorians and supporters of Urban's. Papal legate and resolute enforcer of ecclesiastical discipline, Hugh of Lyon, was most likely in Piacenza too, along with the chronicler Bernold of Constance, who was a rather loud voice for reformist thinking and stricter monastic practices. It was actually Bernold of Constance's records that give us the quote-unquote, in his own words, 200 bishops and 4,000 other clerics figures. Now, why does this matter? Knowing who made up Pope Urban II's papal curia at Piacenza in 1095. This wasn't just a group of men attending an important meeting. No, this was Urban's innermost circle. They didn't just show up. They shaped the council's outcomes. They drafted policies. They gave Urban an intellectual and spiritual whetstone upon which to sharpen himself as he faced the world. And they acted, like those 12 men 1,000 years before them, as apostles for spreading Urban's plans and intentions and doctrines far and wide. Together, they facilitated the dramatic canons, political maneuvering, and Eastern pleas that came to define the Council of Piacenza. Now, in addition to Urban's papal curia, was one of the leading secular figures in not just the region, but at least in name, for deeds recently shown and a steadfastness rarely seen in the dirty world of politics. The one and the only, Matilda of Canossa, Countess Matilda, de facto ruler of the Papal States Duchy of Tuscany. Piacenza was her turf. As we know, she basically ran northern Italy for all intents and purposes. She was Urban's personal hostess, and it was her soldiers who patrolled the roads and rivers in and out of the region. She made the Council of Piacenza possible. We cannot forget that. And we can't forget about Adelaide, Presida, Eupraxia of Kiev, whatever you want to call her. But at Piacenza, she would have been known to all as Empress Adelaide, another honored guest of Countess Matilda's who'd been staying at Canossa for at least a year. The fact that Adelaide was there must have sent shockwaves through Henry's entire being. It was a seriously bad look for his wife to have willingly been extracted by his archenemy's soldiers and is being cared for and treated with the utmost respect, especially while he was stuck in fair Verona, unable to go home. What's more, Empress Adelaide would ask to speak at the council, so yeah, hold on to that one. Now, along with these women were an entire entourage from Constantinople led by John the Oxite, the future Patriarch of Antioch. John the Oxite was appointed for this position by Emperor Alexius I himself, so it's implied that a number of meetings with the Eastern Roman Emperor were had. John the Oxite was a profoundly important figure to have been given such an honor to carry the emperor's words, his own words, to Western Christendom. His message, too, would be given audience by all in attendance. And it would be John the Oxite's words that would, according to chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres, one of the leading contemporary chroniclers of the First Crusade, mind you, more or less light the slow fuse that would explode at Clermont. Now, beyond this, hundreds of pro-Gregorian clergy from northern Italy, Burgundy, southern France, Germany, and possibly Iberia flocked to Piacenza. Monastic representatives were also in attendance from places like Cluny, who were the beating hearts of truly vast networks of smaller monasteries. All of these folks acted as funnels to guide the messages of Piacenza throughout their lines of communication with great speed. Merchants traveled fast and they had loose lips wherever they went. But there was something to be said about the networks of monasteries and how quickly they could pump information around great distances during the Middle Ages. Something pretty phenomenal. Now, further down the secular pecking order were nobles, loyal to Matilda and other French and German and English monarchies. But there are hints that one Count Roger of Sicily may actually have been in attendance at Piacenza. Nothing confirmed, but historians believe it could have been something he'd been interested in, for sure. He was currently undergoing legacy building projects, and what better way to spread the word of one's great deeds than to show up at a synod council thing where anyone who is anyone would either be in attendance or certainly have envoys to relay a very unique and profoundly important achievement anyone in Christendom would have envied to have earned. Roger of Sicily could personally, if he was there, boast to the entire Christian world, even those as far as Eastern Rome, mind you, through those envoys, that he had successfully rid the island of Sicily of Muslim rule once and for all. Stop and think about that. All in attendance. Italians, French, even the Byzantines. They were unable to do this to Sicily. Count Roger was the man who did it. That's a big message. Now, given the scale of Piacenza and what's about to erupt later that year, well, Count Roger would have been admired far and wide, and his story would spread far quicker than it would had he just not been there to converse personally with those in attendance. In addition to Count Roger of Sicily, it's highly likely that a future Crusader legend, Hugh of Vermandois, may very well have been in attendance as well. There's also evidence to suggest that Urban invited all the schismatics, which again is the word they used for pro-Henry bishops and priests. He invited them all to join them at Piacenza. Now, if true, they no doubt would have been given a chance to reconcile with Urban. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But if anything, they may have shown up to report to Henry on the temperature of the situation. Either way, Urban may have used their possible presence as a way to show his dominance over Henry and his schismatic lackeys. And speaking of Emperor Henry IV, given that Piacenza was in part a rally against him and his rule, it's worth just establishing that he was not in attendance, nor were anti-Pope Clement III and most of his supporters. Also, not present at Piacenza was Archbishop Bernard of Toledo. But if you remember, this was during some seriously dismal days in Christian Iberia, as armies of Almoravids were flooding the peninsula, trying to reclaim it in the name of Islam. It's understandable why the Archbishop of Toledo was not there, but curiously, with the exception of Roger of Sicily, the southern Normans, Duke Roger Borsa, Prince Bohemond of Taranto, Jordan of Capua, for instance, they were inexplicably absent. Given the role they would soon play, I find that shocking personally. Not so curiously absent, though, were the kings of England and France, that is, William Rufus and Philip I, respectively, as well as major Normans in Normandy, like Robert Curthose, for instance. Now, I feel I'd be remiss if I left out how we know what we know about the Council of Piacenza. In our modern day, one specific book rises to the top as the foremost tome cataloging this event. It's a book called Pope Urban II's Council of Piacenza, 1095, by historian Robert Somerville. Somerville is, in our own times, almost single-handedly responsible for pulling the information together in one single book. As of this particular recording, Amazon's running that book at $99, and my local library couldn't find it either, so sadly, I was unable to get my hands on it. But I found a great deal of his work and others' work online, so that's mainly where I'm pulling this all from. I was able to get my hands on some near-contemporary accounts, though, which is arguably better. The tricky part about collecting information on the Council of Piacenza is that no one was writing it down in real time. For instance, Somerville had to hunt down and sift through around 30 12th century documents and chronicles to make his conclusions for his book, which is widely considered by his peers as pretty reliable. Piacenza lacks a lot of hard evidence. We don't even have archaeological evidence to point us to, as so many of the structures built for this event were temporary. And again, records weren't written down for years. But we can only go with what we have. So we do know that a certain Bernold of Constance was an eyewitness to the council, so he is our closest source. He's the one who gives us the crowd sizes. He's the one who gives us the presence of the Byzantine envoys, and he's the one who gives us the details of the several sessions throughout those days. He also confirms the presence and testimony of one Empress Adelaide. Bernold of Constance is a rock-solid attendee and is our primary Western source. Beyond him, a close associate of Urban's was a man named Fulcher of Chartres, which some of you medievalists might quickly recognize as the author of arguably the most reliable chronicle of the First Crusade left to us, entitled Gesta Francorum Hierosolymmatorum. Fulcher of Chartres most likely did not attend Piacenza, to be clear, did not, but he reports on it in that document I said once and never ever want to say that title again. Being in Urban's inner circle makes him a pretty reliable source, but not an eyewitness. It's a big distinction. Now, Fulcher of Chartres references Alexius's appeal to Western Christians, but he makes the mistake of blending Piacenza into Clermont. So one must read his account of this with a pretty keen eye. What he says isn't entirely incorrect, but the order of things can certainly be off. Fulcher's French fanboy, Robert the Monk, rewrote Fulcher's Gesta as late as 1120, so by this logic, he would make some of the same mistakes as Fulcher did. But we can take it almost as we take Fulcher's account. Another chronicler was Eckhard of Ora. He did not attend, but he was plugged in enough to give secondhand information about what occurred there. Eckhard of Ora would be a third record of Empress Adelaide's presence and testimony, further validating what you'll hear on the next episode. Eckhard served as a good corroborating source, but nothing more. Certainly, again, not an eyewitness, which is ideal. And finally, of the Western chroniclers, a man named Guibert of Nogent, who I imagine will play into our story quite a bit when we get to the 12th century. Well, he also writes about the relevance and importance of Piacenza, but he relies quite heavily on previous works and oral tradition, which, as we know, can be so easily manipulated from person to person. So, having an idea about where it was held, who attended it, and who chronicled it, let's finally get into it, shall we? Now, obviously, no Google Calendar invites exist from the Council of Piacenza, but we can reasonably infer, based on our sources, what a day-by-day accounting probably looked like, given the patterns that papal synods and secular councils assumed throughout the Middle Ages, certainly in the 11th century. Piacenza, as we'll call it, in short, opened on Friday, March 1st, 1095, and it ended on Thursday, March 7th. Day 1 would have been a rather formal occasion, with an opening liturgy led most certainly by Pope Urban II himself, likely at a large church or a temporary outdoor chapel near the city, which brings up an interesting point to note. Piacenza was somewhat of the Indianapolis of its day. Now go with me on this. It was a city that lay along countless roads, a major pilgrimage route, and two well-trafficked waterways. It was mid-sized, but it had for a very long time been a crossroads of everyone from popes and kings to merchants and pilgrims. Typically, Piacenza was a stop-off on a longer journey, but it had adapted to be able to handle large influxes of travelers and guests. In much the same way, Indianapolis is that city here in the United States, literally holding the title of Crossroads of America. It's held countless annual conventions, a Super Bowl, Major League sports teams, and two of the largest and most respected races at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Piacenza, like Indianapolis, was adapted to welcoming transient groups as well as a steady stream of travelers. However, the Council of Piacenza, to everyone's surprise, blew up to be far larger than expected and planned for. By the first day of the council, Piacenzans had already been forced to build a number of makeshift chapels inside and outside of the city's walls. In fact, in the fields and woods around the city, it said that Piacenza was surrounded by guests that resembled a besieging army. The overfill lots basically had overfill lots, which, as you can imagine, would naturally put major strains on every aspect of infrastructure, from food supplies to traffic, from safety to sanitation. So with all of that said, day 1, Pope Urban II's liturgy either excluded a large number of people, as it was held inside one of the churches, or he held it in an outdoor venue. There's no way to know for sure, but so far as I can tell, both are equally plausible. He would do this at Clermont, this outdoor seating sort of arrangement. This was more than a church event. This was a PR stunt meant for as many eyes and as many ears Urban could gather. Holding it outside would have sent a big precedent, a big message to the world that Urban was returning the church to the people and yanking it away from the nobility who had controlled it for so many centuries. After Urban's liturgy, a formal roll call would have occurred listing every single person who stopped by the sign-in table and grabbed their name tags and gift baggies. Lists had to have been taken quite a while, as roll calls were more than just saying a name. Back then, a name was said, and the person would visually be acknowledged in front of his or her host, meaning they would have had to walk out of the crowd and present him or herself to Urban directly. Now, after all are accounted for, I can't imagine with such a crowd that most of the day's time was probably spent, but there would be certain messages given by various contingents, such as Empress Adelaide and maybe even the Abbot of Cluny. These were mere welcoming speeches, but I find it funny that nowhere that I've found so far tells me that the woman who made all of this happen, Matilda of Canossa, stood to speak. It seems that she felt her actions spoke louder than her words, which is actually an admirable quality for any leader. Day 1 would have led into day 2, but day 2 would have focused on reorienting the church in Urban's Gregorian influence direction. Day 2 was packed with doctrinal discussions and arguments. Deliberation about all sorts of reformist ideas were held in front of the Pope, as well as in small, informal, what we might call today breakout sessions, around the city. As designed, everything was on the table. They tackled simony, clerical marriage, and concubinage practices, clerical celibacy in general, baptisms and burials for hire, which I find rather interesting topic, if I do say so myself. And they also tackled a smattering of current heresies. Now let's start with the baptisms and burials for hire. Yeah, you heard that right. By 1095, a quiet but nearly ubiquitous practice had descended upon Western Christendom in which priests would actually charge money for what amounted to essential Christian rites. These fundamental rights of the Christian had become a pay-to-play hustle. What did this mean? Okay, if you, a lowly peasant with very little to your name but your dignity, your family, and your faith, if you wanted to baptize, say, your newborn, then your local priest could, and probably did, charge you to do so. And if you couldn't pay up, well, your baby was susceptible to the sufferings of Satan and his minions and would lack the necessary grace of God, I guess. And in a world as religiously driven and deadly as that world was, you baptized your babies to hedge your bets. You could argue that, according to church teachings, this was a freely given right, as it's essential for salvation, right? But let's be honest. Very few lay people could read, let alone understand, church doctrine. Your ignorance is that corrupt priest's opportunity. The same went for Christian converts. Imagine paying to join a religion. It's unfathomable how something that is spiritual and not in its core tied to material things like money could be a factor in your conversion. As for conducting funerals and burial ceremonies, especially on consecrated ground, and Catholics take this one quite seriously then as well as now, well, priests had weaponized their privileged position to ensure one's soul moved on properly by 1095. Can't pay? Well, good luck with that eternal rest, buddy. This practice blurred the lines between a sacred act and a market transaction. It was considered a form of simony, which was strictly condemned by Pope Urban II and all his fellow Gregorians, who found the practice one of the most deceitful and corrupt of all of them. Simply put, you can't sell grace, and you shouldn't monetize death. Charging for sacraments was seen as profaning the holy and exploiting the laity, especially the poor, which undermined the moral authority of the clergy and fed the perception that the church was just another racketeering operation. And Urban II and other Gregorians were sick and tired of that happening. So kicking it off with this issue of charging the faithful like they were customers led to Urban drafting and signing the first 7 canons of the council that tackled corruption within the church in general. Before we get into this, I want to offer some intellectual honesty here. No one has intact records of these canons. Rather, historian Robert Somerville reconstructed numerous 12th century accounts of the Council of Piacenza, published in his keystone book, again, that Pope Urban II's Council of Piacenza, back in 2011. Well, he came up with the following list. So let's trust Somerville's research here and get into these canons a little bit, shall we? So Canon 1, the universal condemnation of simony, read something like this, quote, "No one shall presume to give or receive a benefice or ecclesiastical dignity for money," end quote. Well, you can't get much clearer than that, right? You can't buy or sell sacraments, a reaffirmation against the practice of simony, which, remember, was the practice of buying and selling church offices, but it did extend to this as well. And you went to a priest who charged you, and that priest did the service you bought. That sacrament was considered null and void as well. So if you've already gone through it, whether you're the innocent or not, you had to go back through it. It was null and void. Now, Canon 2, punishment for simoniacal clergy. It read something like, clergy who benefited from or participated in simony were to be immediately disciplined, if not removed from their positions. Now, so to be clear, what constituted simoniacal clergy was anyone who committed the crime of simony. Kind of self-explanatory. Not the person who assumed a role through simony, though. It's a clear distinction. So, a simoniacal bishop could have sold a position, but that new priest was not guilty of simony. If that was the only way to assume that position, then he could very well have been well-meaning. He was just forced to play the game. However, the person creating the game itself was really at fault. This discussion inevitably led to the next major canon, Canon 3, the ban on lay investiture, which read something like, officially, secular rulers are forbidden from granting investiture of ecclesiastical offices. Now, this is the spirit of Pope Gregory VII and was an emphatic middle finger to Emperor Henry IV. Emperors, kings, princes, dukes, they were all forbidden from interfering with church matters, including who each priest and bishop and archbishop was in their realms. Though Henry IV in Germany was the clear recipient of this middle finger, don't kid yourself, King William Rufus of England was just as guilty. Remember, he physically forced Anselm of Bec to become Archbishop of Canterbury just a few years earlier, like breaking a finger and all. Yeah, this canon sent a shot across the bow to every monarch in Europe. Now, Canon 4 was no fees for sacraments, which read something like, Catholic doctrine now officially prohibited charging money for all sacraments. Seems redundant, right? But you can't be too clear and too careful when dealing with legalistic corruption. Canon 4 reiterated Urban's stance that all sacraments were freely offered by the Church. Let's just lay it out there ourselves as to what constitutes a Catholic sacrament, the things that Jesus laid out as holy gifts to all of the faithful. So this canon protected the free transaction, right, you could say, between priest and the person, the lay person, right? The following were to be free forevermore: baptism, confirmation, participation in the Eucharist, confession and forgiveness of one's sins, anointing of the sick and dying, ordination as priests, which extends to the creation of holy orders, which will become quite prevalent in the coming decades, and finally, the blessing of marriage. Urban is being as plain and clear as he can possibly be. From Saturday, March 2nd, 1095, on, these sacraments will always, without exception, be freely given by the Catholic clergy everywhere, so long as that person is not excommunicated or, in the faith. Now, Canon 5 was the trial for candidate misconduct, which read something like, clergy accused of simony or unchastity must undergo a formal canonical trial. Now, this canon extended beyond the trial to include what happens if convicted of that crime or sin. What's more, given the context here, we can rightfully conclude that this included the exclusion of secular influence on the trial. That's a big one. Think back to William Rufus's trial of his Bishop of Durham recently. Urban sought to draw a distinct line between what constitutes a secular crime and an ecclesiastical one. This would have farther implications than mere simony and celibacy. This would challenge secular rule over secular crimes if committed by clergy. Just something to keep an eye on there going forward. Canon 6, no desertion of clerical duties, which probably read something like, priests who abandon their posts without valid cause are subject to discipline. Now, this was a warning to all those who knew they were guilty of any of these canons who tried to flee to avoid discipline. Just suck it up, take it across the chin, and move on. Showing up for your trial was infinitely better for you than not. Now, Canon 7 was excommunication for reform resistors, which read something like, anyone who openly resists or undermines in any way these Gregorian reforms faces automatic excommunication. This one was the broken arrow order. When all seemed lost, when folks refused to follow any of the previous canons or any that may arise in the future, well, see you in hell, I suppose. What's more is that Somerville implies this included both cleric and lay folk, which changed the landscape of everything. And you might have the same thought I had. I thought to myself, Gregorians believed in a separation of church and state to a degree, right? But if you resisted their church policies and doctrines, even in the secular arena, then you could suffer spiritual consequences. So which is it? Separation or not? Was Urban really implying that the church was superior to an emperor or a king? Was Urban really implying that secular rulers had no influence on the church, but the church had influence over secular affairs? Well, yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what's implied here, and it hit just as hard as Gregory VII's and Matilda's 27 Dictates of the Pope. In fact, Canon 7 of the Council of Piacenza was a crystal clear, hey, why don't you all go back and read those 27 dictates again, just as a refresher, because, well, I'm pretty serious about them. And for those listening who want to do the same, refer back to episode 124 entitled Dictatus Papae. But why do these matter? Why are we spending time on the individual canons of the Council of Piacenza anyway? Well, the Middle Ages weren't just battles for territory and supremacy. They weren't just about which person or family rose to the top of the political hierarchy. They weren't just about inventions and migrations and pilgrimage. In my estimation, what I've learned about history throughout my life is that specifically regarding the Middle Ages, it's about the evolution of thought, Western thought specifically. I stand firm on the fact that American schools refuse to acknowledge this because, God forbid, we teach someone an opposing view of the world, even if that view of the world was directly influenced by a worldview they reject. We're not all Catholics here. Heck, we're not even all Christians listening to this podcast. Full disclosure, as you've heard before, I'm struggling with it all myself. I was baptized Catholic, raised Protestant. I adhere to a Christian-influenced Western worldview, but I struggle with the faith part. But I can't tell you how valuable it's been in my studies of the Middle Ages to understand the intricacies of the Catholic faith. Not because I accept it per se, rather because Catholicism, whether we like it or not, is the ideological system the Western world emerged from. It's that simple. The evolution of Western civilization is, in my opinion, in part, a big part, the evolution of the Catholic Church, at least up to the Renaissance. And this is precisely because those who lived through these times felt the deepest connections to their religion. Everything stemmed from their faith, even those who tried to game the system. I haven't said it in a while on this show, but I'll say it again here. We are who we are because they were who they were. So yes, learning about the specifics of the Council of Piacenza is valuable to our understanding of how our history played out. What else could explain Anselm becoming Canterbury's archbishop if not for investiture, even of the forceful kind? What else could explain Matilda's position as a champion of 11th century of Tuscany, if not for her ride-or-die mentality toward the papacy and the Gregorian reforms she herself helped mold? So we've taken a look at the agenda, the attendees, and the first 2 days of the Council of Piacenza in March of 1095. These first 2 days were a celebration of the triumph of Gregorian reform movement, and the 7 canons would go on to serve as a backbone of papal diplomacy and supremacy for decades to come. On the next episode, we'll focus on the other issues Piacenza presented to the world: accusations against Henry, Byzantine appeals for aid, and even a couple heresies that need to be dealt with. These would all be discussed over the next 5 days, while all Christians the world over watched and listened and waited. Until next time.